We come to the fifth presentation of the Parayana, which is Sanskrit. Para means above or beyond. Yana is way. Like the Mahayana is the great way. And we have already begun to talk about how the Mahayana has its roots, its seed in St. Thomas, who went to India in 41 AD and was in the far south of India, where the shipping from the Egyptian ports of Myos, Hormos, and Berenice would clear the Red Sea and the islands of Socotra and go across in season to the southern tip of India, to the Malabar coast. And there were trading adventures going on since the time of Queen Hatshepsut, 1500 BC. And they began very large because Hatshepsut was really quite extraordinary. And when she would send trading vessels, she would send 60 at a time. She really did things big. So by the time of 1550 years later, when St. Thomas went to India, in that time, in the Hellenistic period, Alexandria had taken over what the power structure of the pharaohs had and established the Ptolemaic structure. And the international trading part of the Ptolemaic international structure were Jews. They were Jewish. Alexander the Great, when he conquered the city of Tyre, Tyre, Tyre had its shipping power in an island off the coast of Phoenicia, and wherever they established colonies, and they established them all through the Eastern Mediterranean. They founded Carthage, they founded what became Marseille, they went out into the Atlantic Ocean as far as the Cameroons in Africa, and up the Spanish, Portuguese coasts. So they were extremely adept at this. But the Jews had been taken along by Alexander because they had, at his time, already 2,000 years experience with international trade. With Sargon of Akkad, his trading kingdom became the Fertile Crescent, linking not only the Persian Gulf with the Mediterranean Sea, but expanded all the way out to the island of Cyprus and expanded eastward along the coasts of what is today Iran and Pakistan into India, so that Sargon the Great, by 2300 BC, had an international trading empire between Cyprus and the Indus River civilizations. So that Alexander the Great, who was a very deep student of history, understood that the Semitic, North Semitic peoples, especially who became Jews with Abraham, they really knew how to deal with many languages and many currencies and to find a common denominator among all of them and be able to carry on what was really almost a world-class ability. And Alexander the Great decided to push as far as India to the east, and when he was a little older, when he was in his late 30s, he would push all the way west as far as the British Ireland islands. He had a a Marseille descendant of the Phoenicians, who was a master sailor, who circumambulated the British Isles, including Ireland, and went as far as Iceland out into the North Atlantic by 320 BC, 320s BC. And so Alexander was capable and prepared his trading empire for his world of one mankind. The Greek word for that was the oikumene, from which we get the Latin ecumene, which meant ecumenical, including everyone. That there was a family of man, and that one of the stays was the great vision that there was an ecumene, and the spread of an international world mankind business network sustained that. That the military might have been the ability to pioneer conflicts, but the settled part of it, like we would say today, the global intercorporate world, is a business world, not necessarily sustaining itself by military means, but tempering its expansion and its suzerainty over others in terms of not some one, but in terms of what we would call today a multinational global investiture. And that's what Alexander had, and used the international Hebrew Hellenistic Jews. They were not yet rabbinical Jews. In 41 AD, that was already 50 years before, there was the Council of Jamnia that ushered in the rabbinic Judaism. The Hellenistic Judaism was totally international from the times of Sargon on. And so for almost 2,500 years, Hellenistic Judaism was the international coin of the family of man realm. And so one has to understand that the creme de la creme of Hellenistic Judaism, Jesus, was not only a worldwide visionary, but going off into distances so far that in the Pistis Sophia, he answers Mary Magdalene when she asks, what is the real context of all of this for man? He says, everything that you see and can see, the planets, the stars, there is a distance so far that all of that will be seemingly like a speck. And then he does this transform for her 6 times, so that in the 7th range, one understands that it is a cosmos of unbelievable vastness, and that the family of man is a very important participant in being able to cross the threshold from this world to the next worlds, plural, which is all possible worlds. And that threshold is a gap. And that one, in teaching about reality, teaches the vision of how to go across the gap and reach the other shore. By now we should say the other shores, big time plural. There are more galaxies in the cosmos than there are sands of the Ganges. The vastness is incredible. It was St. Thomas that brought this Mahayana seed to India, first in the south, in what today is the Kerala province, and then quickly went to the north, where the Hellenistic Greco-Roman kingdoms established by Alexander the Great were still flourishing. And under invitation by Gondophares, Gondophares had written to Jesus would he send him an architect to build a palace that would be worthy of this new vision of man. And Jesus, after the resurrection, made sure that there were disciples that were sent in places that would highlight the spectrum. And one of them was sending Thomas to India, to land in Kerala, and then to go to the north to Gandhara to be the architect, because Thomas was an architect, so that the beginnings of the Mahayana had a double attractor, like a butterfly effect and chaos theory. It had this ability to be simultaneously tuned in the far south and in the far north. In Kerala, initially, but across the narrower peninsula of southern India to the other coast, where today is largely the very large city. It used to be called for a long time Madras. Now it's called Chennai. And it is in Madras to Kerala that one finds a trek across that peninsula point of India. And one of the earliest cities founded by St. Thomas is still called Salem. There is a Salem, India. Just south of Madras, where the Adyar River runs into the Bay of Bengal, part of the large Indian Ocean, is the mound that has the tomb of St. Thomas, and it's still there. It was visited by Marco Polo and described in his travels very, very much. Just south of that is where the Sri Aurobindo ashram, great ashram, is on that same coast. And if you go a little bit further south, there is a series of islands or islets called Adam's Rib that span an arc and go to ancient Sri Lanka, to Ceylon. And so that whole region was developed as a sympathetic pair, a tuned pair with the North Indian of Gandhara. And in order to seed Gandhara, the far east of the north is what is today Bangladesh. And it's there in that Bangladesh region that some of the Brahmins were extremely sophisticated, and they were able to produce one of the greatest men of the age, whose name is Ashvaghosha. We've talked about how his name means, Ashva in Sanskrit is horse, and Ghosha is the sound of the whinnying of the horse, the triumphal, elegant nobleness of it. And Ashvaghosha was arguing against the old Buddhists, the Theravada, the elders' path. The difference between a Vada and a Yana is that a Vada is a path. It's like a line of development that one follows. And the Yana, the way, is like a field. It's like a matrix. It is quite a different scalar. And we'll talk a lot today about the difference between a lineage and a way. When Jesus would talk about what he was doing, he would talk about the way. And one of the famous quotes is, "I am the way." entering through me, one enters into the way. It's not a vada, it's not a path. It's a way. And so the Mahayana was the great way. And Ashvaghosha had gone to argue in northwest India against the champion of this new Mahayana, who was saying, and his name was Parshva, and Parshva said, I have learned from St. Thomas the great way. And you are mistaken in arguing because you're arguing against a vada. You're completely absorbed then in both your arguments and your mental state that it is not pro or con a vada or any kind of a path. The way is like an infinite field which has a particular affinity with the zero field of nature, which nevertheless mysteriously is a fertile zero field. And Ashvaghosha was converted to the Mahayana and wrote the first great book on it, The Awakening of Faith in the Mahayana. You will never find faith, in Sanskrit faith is Shraddha. You will never find any Buddhist sutra that talks about faith. No one in the Theravada ever talked about faith. It was the method of the practice. And it was a remembered, passed on tradition by the Theras, the elders, so that the elder way is the way in which we learned from the Buddha. We learned because we memorized his teachings, and when we wrote them down, they became the sutras. And that sutra in Sanskrit means thread. It means the thread of integral continuity. And so all of the sutras were really the integral continuity that is passed on exactly and accurately from the Buddha. But the Buddha was, as we would say, using a Tolkien word, he was eucatastrophically, that is a catastrophe that's happy. He was eucatastrophically happy in his complexity, so that one can learn to read not only between the lines in sutras, but one can be holding the thread of a sutra and sense its vibration. And that the vibration of that sutra sends out a resonance that has eventually a scalar of harmonics. And one learns to do what we call today in mathematics for some while, a harmonic analysis of the sutra by its resonant sets. And one of the tone keys to a resonant set is to understand time. If you do not understand time, you do not understand space. And if you do not understand time or then space, you do not understand what we call the universe. And not understanding that, you have no beginning of apperception of the cosmos, and thus to you, hidden under layer upon layer upon layer, is reality. The great way is the way across that impasse of the gap, getting into the other shore and wakefulness itself into consciousness. The difference between wakefulness is that it can have a physiological basis. You can wake up from sleeping. You can stop dreaming and come to. But wakefulness is to dreaming and sleeping like consciousness is to wakefulness. And so there is a quality that emerges where the early Mahayana geniuses were actually architects in a way, like St. Thomas and coming into Parshva. And with Ashvagosha, he had the architecture of showing the Mahayana. And later on, the great architectural developer of the Mahayana was Nagarjuna. And Nagarjuna was from the far north of the Bay of Bengal coast, north from Madras, is the Andhra province, and it has two great rivers that come into the Bay of Bengal. One is the Krishna River, going all the way into central India, and the other one goes all the way into almost the depths of the center of India. And it was there on the banks of that river that a great stupa complex was built by Nagarjuna as the architect, and it was called Amaravati. And Amaravati is a Mahayana transform of what was built in central India near the beginnings of that great river. And that center was called Sanchi. And Sanchi was built by the great Ashoka, who reigned in India for over half a century. And it was the Buddhist Greco version of the old Theravada. And Ashoka was spared being killed in all the warfare of the sons of the Alexander the Great of India, who took over and had so many sons by so many different women that they were constantly fighting each other and killing each other off as soon as he passed away. And Ashoka was scot-free from that because he was a mulatto. He was half black from the center of India, in that Deccan desert region. One of the man who taught me the Bhagavad Gita at the University of Wisconsin, a soil engineer, was from Nagpur, which is the city in the center of the Deccan area, the desert. And his name was Sudarshan Puri. And he was dark, he was black, like an African, but he was Indian, an Indian black. And so the mother of Ashoka was actually a Greek woman marrying, and Ashoka was born as a mulatto. He had splotchy skin. He had kind of like the golden yellow irises and the short curly hair. And Ashoka, because he was spared from all of the more military brothers, stepbrothers, half-brothers, and so forth, that when he took over, there was a tremendous army, but nobody knew how to run a kingdom. And so Ashoka, when he finally took over, having won the last battles, he disbanded the armies. And he set up at the entrances to this vast Indian kingdom, all of central and northern India, almost down to the southern point of India, in one empire, Ashoka's Maurya empire. And he set up pillars with 4 lion heads at the top and inscribed the Buddhist rules for living on those pillars. They're called the Edicts of Ashoka, and we have them translated. And so anyone entering into India would not only enter into a peaceful empire, but Ashoka made vast roads all across, webbing that whole part of northern India, and then planted along those roads medicinal herbs, fruit trees, places of rest, so that there was a concourse. And for 50 years, there were no conquerors of India, there were no wars in India, there were no armies in India. And he built at Sanchi the great stupa, which had a part of the cremated Buddha's bones that were put there as a kind of a talisman that all of what we are teaching is real, rooted in the bones. That we have a natural base which is truthfully real. And as far as we go from wakefulness to threshold challenges to crossing over this enormous gap into a new consciousness, which is an ecology that brings all of the cycles of nature. Nature's cycle on this planet is such and so. Nature's cycle on jillions of other planets is quite different, but is such and so for them. And so the cosmos is an ecology, whereas the nature of particular worlds is that natural cycle, which has many variations, in fact, variations without end. But what's important is to recognize that when one is crossing over that gap, and the gap is not a link, it's not on any path, all vadas end. They don't go there. There's nowhere to go. They go nowhere. And so they curl back upon themselves and they reiterate the stages and steps of their path. They do not go into the yana. And so the Mahayana for a long time was extremely difficult until Asvaghosha's great Shraddhapada sutra. They changed sutra so that it was like an introduction. And so it had a little bit different tone. It wasn't just holding the thread, it was holding the live resonances and getting to the harmonic. And Nagarjuna brought out the harmonic of the gap, of the void, of the emptiness. That there is a harmonic of the shunyata, of shunyata. Has no the to it at all. But shunyata is harmonic to what is, tacita, to being, to living, to loving. And that the two together do not form an integral. They form a differential, transform, which has so much transformed juice that it's able to transform a second time into a kaleidoscopic consciousness. So that when you come to what was a refinement of the Mahayana, the Vajrayana, you find in Tibet classic little, they're not very big at all. They are writings that are like the seal. This one is called the Great Seal of Voidness. It was written a long time ago, about 500-600 years ago, by the first Panchen Lama. And it's reprinted here in translation into English. The Library of Tibetan Works and Commentaries. One has to be able to understand in terms of really transformed consciousness. The difference between a differential consciousness, which is visionary, and a kaleidoscopic consciousness, which is historical, is one begins to understand the importance of time forms in this application to keep the pairedness of shunyata and tathata resonantly together. They do not mulch. They do not merge. They're not integrals at all. So that one can learn from someone else who is not on a vada, a path. So if you're on some path, you are missing out, not of the past, you can learn that path, but you're missing out all of the resonances, and then beyond that, the vast harmonics that are possible in reality. And so the Parayana here is to deliver that invitation, that there are gifts beyond number that are real, they are cosmic, they are approachable, and you can begin on paths, plural, but one needs to be able to refine that transformation is strong enough to have a transformation of itself. So that the ancient way in which Alexandrian wisdom, the Hagia Sophia, put it, is that reality is thrice greatest. And someone who can teach on the scalar of thrice greatest has a seal on the truthfulness of the high Dharma. There are dharmas on a path. There are truths. Truth is on the path. But the high Dharma, the Hagia Sophia, is that there is a truthfulness beyond belief, beyond ideation, beyond mentality, that has comprehension. It's prehensile, but prehensile in a very special way. It is shareable. And its shareability is one of the ways that you can test the wind of wisdom. If it's not shareable in a very beautiful way, then it's not the high Dharma. One of the great poets of the high Dharma was Shantideva. His Bodhikaryavitara was written in the 8th century, the 700s, and he has a beautiful way of saying it. And we talked about it a little bit last week. One should not turn from difficulties because of regard for his reputation. One is without rest, protecting that reputation. Whoever wishes to quickly rescue himself and another should practice the supreme mystery, the exchanging of himself with the other. It's the secret exchange of selves that is the high Dharma sharing. The Parayana takes the Mahayana and its revising diamond way, the Vajrayana, and carries it into that hermetic thrice greatest harmonic. The Parayana is upon us invitationally to the dance of reality. Let's take a little break and we'll come right back to it. Let's come back to being on a path and undergoing a transform of the Great Way so that one follows resonances to the harmonic, and that harmonic delivers a kaleidoscopic consciousness out of the differential consciousness of vision, out of the way in which the path was understood between the lines and resonantly outside the lines. I'm showing a portrait of one of the great Vajrayana figures of our time. This is Karma Thinley Rinpoche, and this is a portrait of him done at a series of 3 seminars for 10 days as a group, a triple group, that I held in Los Angeles in 1976. And he signed this portrait with his signature on the bottom in green. And you can see that Karma Thinley, in addition to being a Dharma master of many padas, is also a great poet and a great artist. The first half concluded with something from the great Buddhist poet Shantideva, and you can find a translation of the Bodhicharyavatara in Oxford World Classics. It's a pretty good translation. I like the old hardcover, and you can find paperbacks of it translated by Marian Maddox, and especially the Dalai Lama's 1979 Transcendent Wisdom, taking a long time, not too fast and revving up, but a long settling into a commentary on the 9th of 10 books of the Bodhicharyavatara. The way in which the Vajrayana was best presented, Karma Thinley, in his 1976 series of seminars, the first of the series was on the Tibetan language, because Tibetan language was like Sanskrit. It was made from the beginning to be a wisdom language. It was never a peasant language. It never had its roots in the ground, as it were. It always was from the point of view of being able to seed the prepared ground with developments, and so the Tibetan language is a wisdom language, much like Greek became later on, and Sanskrit for sure. Sanskrit was developed out of Avestan about 1500 to 1700 BC. Avestan was first made a written language of high wisdom, high dharma, by Zarathustra about 1900 BC. The second series was on the 16 Karmapas, and the third on Tibetan Buddhism. And for 10 days, each hour, the language, the Karmapas, and then the resonance to the Vajrayana were presented by Karma Thinley. He was, at the time, had a center in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And he went there in 1971, just after I had gone to Calgary, Alberta, Canada, to develop a 16-course interdisciplinary education. And so he and I were really contemporaries of new visitors, refugees to Canada about the same time. And in 1976, it was quite an extraordinary thing to be able to be very close with someone who was ostensibly from the mystical, occult, other part of the world, and to be completely at home. Shareable. Karma Tinley wore cowboy boots. And I asked him one time, I said, "Why do you wear cowboy boots?" He said, "Because I'm tall and I want to be taller." And the last time that we were able to be together physically, he was staying at a Dharma house out in Avenue 64 near Pasadena in Los Angeles, off Figueroa, North Figueroa. And when I drove him there and was walking him up to have our final little chat on the second floor at his room, the house was lined with devotees to take puja, to take initiations with him. In Sanskrit, initiation is abhiseka. And he walked nodding, and we went up the stairs and went into his room and had our last chat together. And it was time for me to go, and so we both stood up, and he stood so that he stood, and just spontaneously, he was standing in front of an open window where the glare of the sunlight outside, I could not make out his features for a moment. And he stood there and in Tibetan gave me a blessing and said in English later, "This is for you to establish a karma house." And that's the last time physically. He also said, you have to go to your work and I have to go down and be a lama. So it's that kind of a quality that is happening here. The history of the Karmapas became a book published, The History of the 16 Karmapas of Tibet. This was a transcript from his talks that he put down from his from notes from others and from what he could add, and then it was translated out of the Tibetan into English and published in Boulder, Colorado by the Parayana Press in 1980. The foreword is by Chogyam Trungpa, who gracious enough, but he adds that he was a teacher of Karma Tinley, and this is actually not the case. He was quite beyond even Karma. Tinley was quite beyond what Chogyam Trungpa was able to do. You have to understand that the Trungpas and the Karmapas are interrelated. Usually the beginnings of a Karmapa would have a head tutor of someone from the Trungpa, and then the Trungpa would have a tutor from the Karmapas, and so they were dovetailed like that for many incarnations, many generations. The interesting thing is that in the Karmapa lineage, the second Karmapa, his name was Karmapakshi, and Karmapakshi was the first tulku in Tibet. A tulku is different from just a reincarnation. A reincarnation means that you have to be tutored and brought back. Yes, you can, because all of the possibilities are there. But a tulku comes back complete. A tulku who awakens complete. And Karmapakshi was the first tulku. One of the dearest friends of Karma Tinley was Tarthang Tulku, who established the Tibetan centers, the first ones, in the San Francisco, Berkeley area. And one of the closest friends of Tarthang Tulku was Herbert V. Gunther. And Herbert V. Gunther is the author of all of these classic books on the Vajrayana. And his earliest book that's translated, Yogananda, this was published in 1976 in India. Yogananda, the Tantric View of Life. And later on, many decades later, Gunther would do a volume called The Tantric Way of Life, which became one of the really great volumes showing the Vajrayana as a yana and showing that the diamond way has a particular quality to it. He says, he writes in the preface to this later, the Tantric View of Life, "It is my conviction that Tantrism, in its Buddhist form, is of the utmost importance for the inner life of man and so for the future of mankind. If the life of the spirit is to be invigorated, there must be a new vision and understanding. And there is hardly anything of such value in the study of the experiences and teachings in the Buddhist Tantrics. For Tantrism is founded on practice and on an intimate personal experience of reality, of which traditional religions and philosophy have given merely an emotional or intellectual description. And for Tantrism, reality is the ever-present task of man to be." That there is a crossing over through a threshold of emptiness, of void, of shunyata. Later on, I will talk about Karma Tinley's great commentary on Nagarjuna's letter to a friend to show the real high Dharma depth of Karma Tinley and of Herbert Gunther, that there is a quality of needing to understand what is important about presence. The magnum opus of Gunther's translation was kindly bent to ease us with beautiful Bodhi leaves with a Vajra, the lightning implement. And it is a translation of the great master of the Nyingma, not the Gelugpa like the Dalai Lama, not the Kagyupa like the Karmapa, but of the Nyingma going back to the black hats. And the Karmapas always wore not a red hat, but a black hat because there was a link. And the Nyingma was the original Tibetan Buddhism that was established by Padmasambhava, the all-blessed flower of being. And later on we will talk in the Parayana about the two women who were very close to Padmasambhava, Yeshe Tsogyal, sometimes called Sky Dancer, and the Princess Mandarava. And those two women, like a tuning fork, helped make Padmasambhava come from his wakefulness, which was astonishing, to a consciousness which was ebullient to a high Dharma, which is all but unbelievable. The great poet of the Nyingma, the Nyingmapa, was Longchen Pa, the very author translated here in 3 volumes. And Gunther translated a beautiful long poem by Longchenpa. It was privately printed, so there are very few copies available. Longchenpa's translation, his poem, long poem, it's generally called Looking Deeper, a swan's questions and answers, but in the original Tibetan, the title actually means rain of questions and answers. That questions and answers occur in proliferation like a rain. And that it doesn't bother one to get wet, because that's part of the fertility of the natural cycle. But there is such a thing as a rainbow after the rain. And this is what Longchenpa, at the end of some 30-some pages in translation, wrote. May I and all sentient beings find freedom. On the jewel island, everywhere light, where there is no suffering, being the birthplace of bliss. For sentient beings, and where the virtues of the three gestalts, through which being experiences itself as being, are spontaneously present. The rain of a swan's questions and answers has been composed in the ever-present Samya Padmasambhava's residence. He was in Padmasambhava's ancient residence when he wrote this, by the master of poetry in Tibet, and then he gives his name, not for fame or renown, but for easy comprehension. The quality of Gunther towards the culmination, the high point of his life, when he was born in Germany, he was a prodigy. He was born in Bremen, North Germany. And he was blessed with his parents, and his father recognized that his son was drawn to Oriental things. And so he began to get him Chinese lessons when he was 9 years old. And so he was raised not only bilingual, German and Chinese, but it was discovered that he was a language phenomenon. And so Herbert Gunther eventually learned a list of languages that would almost fill a page. He learned Sanskrit and Chinese and Japanese and Tibetan and Hindi and all of the European languages, and so he was really something. When he got his PhDs, he got one from Munich and one from Vienna, and was so talented that he was hired to go to India. One of the big cities on the Ganges is Lucknow. And he went to Lucknow University. It was an intellectual powerhouse at the time in India, and was teaching there. And then he was invited to the top rung of the institutions of university learning, the University of Varanasi. Varanasi is the ancient Benares, the city of light. And then when he was able, by 1964, to be an international sensation on Tibet and on all things Asian, and the European multiple way of understanding different facets of that, he was hired in 1964 by the University of Saskatchewan, which seems an unlikely place. Saskatchewan is in Saskatoon. it's about midway up Saskatchewan, but you have to understand Saskatchewan is much bigger than the state of California. And so Saskatoon is right around where, say, Monterey would be in California. But the farther north from that begins to thin out, like Alberta and Saskatchewan. The pine trees become things that are only about 4 or 5 feet tall, and then there is tundra for hundreds of miles. And when he was invited to Calgary, where I had been teaching for several years at that time, about 3 or 4 years, he was brought to lecture on the Vajrayana, and it was an evening in the wintertime, warm up Calgary, but this time it was like an Arctic deep freeze. It was more than 30 below zero that evening. And for those of you who have never been in such weather, it means that the exhaust from cars comes out like puffy white clouds and just stays there in the air. And with all the headlights and so forth, the exhaust of tens of thousands of rainbows everywhere in Calgary was just 330,000 people. Regia of this joyous roads and so forth. And his talk, he used to share a nice cozy evening on a normal, and began. And his came out. He played the flute in Vienna there, and they married in 1944. And there's Gunther passed away and well known in her own scholarly endeavors. And the other great student of music and musical history, which is in, Brandon is in Winnipeg, it's polar ice, all the polar belts. By the time you get to is the place that A.E. Van Vogt, the great, was born there. Gunther is bring Longchen Pa for Hooray, but I will bring him published by Brill, The Teachings of Padmasambhava. Absolutely a thing which could be, always has been, and also the great and it's called, and Gampo Seed, the 16th Karmapa, the early 1980s, and he was a close friend of Karma. When he passed on, the 17th Karmapa became a kind of a mystery. When the 17th Karmapa was established, actually, unbeknownst to each other, he was established in 2 different places, 2 different births, a pair of births. So that there are 2 17th Karmapas who are tussling with different aspects, as it were, of the Karmapa lineage. One of the deepest mysteries in it is to understand how the Karmapa lineage began, because it was the first Lama lineage in Tibet. So that the passing of the first Karmapa was the shunyata gap, threshold, because the second Karmapa was the first supposedly incarnation of the first Karmapa, whose name was Dusam Khenpa. But Dusam Khenpa was not initially a student of Gampo Pa. He was a thief. And he was a master thief because he was a natural telepath. Yes, can read minds. You bet. And he was able to steal, and he wanted to see what was of value in the central residence of Gampo Pa. And so he snuck in. And Gampo Pa, because when you're on that level, you don't really sleep you can actually look through your eyelids and see what's going on. And you can hear very, very well. And he followed this monkey-faced thief trying to find things, and then he sensed that he was going to read his mind, and so he went into a very high Dharma samadhi, and when Dusam Chimpa read his mind, he had instant enlightenment. And that's how the first Karmapa became spontaneously, and then instantly, a high Dharma teacher. When he passed on in a way in which his inheritor, the second Karmapa, Karmapakshi, was not just an incarnation of the first, but he was the first tulku in Tibetan history. A tulku is a cosmic presence. It does not need to sleep, even in death. The death is not a big sleep for a tulku at all. For almost anyone who doesn't experience this and know this, it seems a little incredible, and it is incredible. It seems unbelievable, it is unbelievable. But credibility and belief are minuscule aspects to mentality, and all of that. At worst, it's a hard rain. At best, it's a fertile rain. But the questions and answers are without end because they're in a natural cycle. And that natural cycle must cycle. It cycles its way. And the repetition, like the 4 seasons, is a way in which it gains its stability where it is. The Dawn spacecraft probe that's approaching the great asteroid dwarf planet Ceres is coming just about the time that there's a confirmation that would have been known first 25 years ago, and almost nobody mentioned it, that the telemetry, analytic, the astrophysics of Ceres showed a signature of water in the atmosphere of Ceres. And now it was confirmed just a couple of days ago that there are 2 huge plumes of water vapor, like water volcanoes on Ceres. It's about 600 miles in diameter. Don't be fooled by size. Enceladus at Saturn has plumes of water, and it's only half the size of Ceres. If someone tells you that there are oceans on Europa that are hundreds of miles deep, and on Ganymede that are almost 1,000 miles deep, it's not that it's not incredible and unbelievable, but that's no reason that it can't be real. And real is better than true. One discovers eventually that what was true now is truer. This quality of Gampopa, to be able to present to Dusam Chemba the instant, not the totality, but the perfection of high Dharma, he learned from Milarepa. And in Milarepa, his way of tuning himself was to write songs. And his songs are poems, some of the greatest poems in the world. And Milarepa wrote 100,000 songs. And they're all translated into 2 huge volumes into English. And Milarepa learned to use a poetic to have an infinite resonance so that his harmonic was able to establish itself infinitely, which meant that it was at home in zero field nature just as well. And his original monastery was by himself in a cave on the upper slopes of Mount Everest. So if you look for the ashram of Milarepa, it's Mount Everest. He sat so long in the cave that he lived on a soup made from pine needles that dropped into his hand that was cupped and held some of the melt water, and he was able to live on that, but it turned him green. So when a couple of thieves with their booty climbed up and into that cave to split up their goods, they didn't know that it was a human being because his hair had grown very long and dust-covered and white, and they were shocked when he spoke to them. The planet is held by a great hand. This is the frontispiece to 5 kingdoms, about the 5 phyla of life on Terra. That's the name of this planet, not Earth, Terra. And it's done by Dorian Sagan, who is the son of Carl Sagan. And this is a page from a website on just a few days ago again of the Earth being held by a hand, because there's conclusive proof now. It reads down below, artist's concept of asteroids delivering amino acids to Earth. The jagged white line at the bottom of the image is the actual data from analysis of the Murchison meteorite. The 2 highest peaks, the amounts of right-handed and left-handed versions of the amino acid isovaline. Note that the highest of these 2 peaks is the amount of left-handed isovaline, revealing an excess of left-handed variety in the meteorite. Our universe prefers handedness, mostly left-handedness, mostly that kind, but it's always in the cosmos balanced. So when the universe has an influence in this way, the cosmos makes up the supersymmetry in other dimensions. And that's how zero gets fertile, to not birth, but to spontaneously emerge time, which then makes instantly the emergence of space blossoming possible. And it is space in its blossoming that makes the integral nature of the universe so dependable and certain. And it means that the uncertainty in that certainty is a really great certainty in the other side. More next week.